Welcome to Post-Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja. And today I'll continue my conversation in my series on Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. We are on the fourth and final chapter. I've already talked about the first part of his argument in this chapter, where he articulates and explains 4 anti-dialogical ways of performing action or of life. And those have been conquest, divide and rule, manipulation, and cultural invasion. In the second part of chapter 4, Friere then gives us the 4 possible competing concepts and practices that form part of his dialogical theory of action. And those are cooperation in opposition to conquest, unity of liberation in opposition to divide and rule, organization against manipulation, and cultural synthesis against cultural invasion. Now, please bear in mind, this is the last chapter of the book. So what he's offering over here by way of 4 anti-dialogical modes of resistance or revolutionary praxis, he just doesn't come up with them in chapter 4. He has built up to this point. So in order to understand it clearly and grasp it better, we have to keep in mind what we have previously read and talked about. Today I'll be covering cooperation, part 1 of the cooperation. I thought to split it into 2 parts. So first, as always, I'm going to read, and then I'll come back and we can talk about it. So here we go. In the theory of anti-dialogical action, conquest, as its primary characteristic, involves a subject who conquers another person and transforms her or him into a thing. In the dialogical theory of action, subjects meet in cooperation in order to transform the world. The anti-dialogical dominating I transforms the dominated, conquered thou, into a mere it. The dialogical I, however, knows that it is precisely the thou, not I, which has called forth his or her own existence. He also knows that the thou, which calls forth his own existence, in turn constitutes an I, which has in his I its thou. The I and the thou thus become, in the dialectic of these relationships, 2 thous, which become 2 Is. The dialogical theory of action does not involve a subject who dominates by virtue of conquest and a dominated object. Instead, there are subjects who meet to name the world in order to transform it. If at a certain historical moment the oppressed, for the reasons previously described, are unable to fulfill their vocation as subjects, the posing of their very oppression as a problem, which always involves some form of action, will help them achieve this vocation. The above does not mean that in the dialogical task there is no role for revolutionary leadership. It means merely that the leaders, in spite of their important, fundamental, and indispensable role, do not own the people and have no right to steer the people blindly towards their salvation. Such a salvation would be a mere gift from the leaders to the people, a breaking of the dialogical bond between them, and a reducing of the people from co-authors of liberating action into the objects of this action. Cooperation, as a characteristic of dialogical action, which occurs only among subjects, who may, however, have diverse levels of function and thus of responsibility, can only be achieved through communication. Dialogue, as essential communication, must underlie any cooperation. In the theory of dialogical action, there is no place for conquering the people on behalf of the revolutionary cause, but only for gaining their adherence. Dialogue does not impose, does not manipulate, does not domesticate, does not sloganize. This does not mean, however, that the theory of dialogical action leads nowhere, nor does it mean that the dialogical human does not have a clear idea of what she wants or of the objectives to which she is committed. The commitment of the revolutionary leaders to the oppressed is at the same time a commitment to freedom. And because of that commitment, the leaders cannot attempt to conquer the oppressed, but must achieve their adherence to liberation. Conquered adherence is not adherence. It is adhesion of the vanquished to the conqueror, who prescribes the options open to the former. Authentic adherence is the free coincidence of choices. It cannot occur apart from communication among people mediated by reality. Thus, cooperation leads dialogical subjects to focus their attention on the reality which mediates them and which, posed as a problem, challenges them. The response to that challenge is the action of dialogical subjects upon reality in order to transform it. Let me re-emphasize that posing reality as a problem does not mean sloganizing. It means critical analysis of a problematic reality. As opposed to the mythicizing practices of the dominant elites, dialogical theory requires that the world be unveiled. No one can, however, unveil the world for another. Although one subject may initiate the unveiling on behalf of others, the others must also become subjects of this act. The adherence of the people is made possible by this unveiling of the world and of themselves in authentic praxis. This adherence coincides with the trust the people begin to place in themselves and in the revolutionary leaders, as the former perceive the dedication and authenticity of the latter. The trust of the people in the leaders reflects the confidence of the leaders in the people. This confidence should not, however, be naive. The leaders must believe in the potentialities of the people, whom they cannot treat as mere objects of their own action. They must believe that the people are capable of participating in the pursuit of liberation. But they must always mistrust the ambiguity of oppressed people, mistrust the oppressor housed in the latter. Accordingly, when Guevara exhorts the revolutionaries to be always mistrustful, he is not disregarding the fundamental condition of the theory of dialogical action. He is merely being a realist. So, as is obvious from the very first line, that he is juxtaposing cooperation against conquest. Now, when we discussed conquest, one important aspect of the conquest was that the dominant group conquers the bodies and minds of the dominated group and treats them as the other, as objects, and as it. The relationship between the two is a subject-object relationship. What he's suggesting here is that the relationship between different constituencies of the revolutionary movement, may they be leaders or those who are called workers, that relationship has to be relation of cooperation and dialogue. And he's citing Martin Buber here, his 1958 book, I and Thou. So that reference to I and Thou is, my thin understanding of Buber is that in his discussion, what he is foregrounding is that the moment I invoke the term I, the other is also invoked. And that other is not or should not be less than me, should be equal to who I am, right? So cooperation must happen in a revolutionary movement, but it must happen in a way where people are not seen as those who need to be led or those who are passive and they must trust and follow the leaders. No. The relationship has to be of dialogic cooperation, where the leaders seek from the people what their hopes and aspirations are, and then they work together. Now remember, there has to be a certain degree of preparatory work before we get to that point, hence our reading of the Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Hence, in the second footnote that he gives on page 169, referring to Che Guevara's journal, where he is skeptical of the peasants, not because he doesn't trust the peasants, but the ground has not yet been prepared. People have not yet liberated themselves from what is housed and lodged in them, and that is the logic of an oppressive system. So in cooperation too, the emphasis is how to build an authentic, so to speak, relationship within the hierarchy of revolution. There will have to be some people who will take leadership roles, but how to create a relationship in which leaders never assume that they know the path and people must follow. So what he's safeguarding against is a certain kind of naive populism. That's why he uses the term sloganeering, right? Because slogans can mobilize people. You can mobilize people's emotions, but then you ask people to fully trust the leaders, right? And the promised land is when we have reached the utopia that we are creating, we will deliver. That is what he wants us to forestall against. And the only way to do that, to build that kind of cooperation, would be where leaders learn from the people. People trust the leaders not because they are naturally leaders, but because people have personally, collectively placed their trust in the leaders as equals. So emphasis in this part then is on subjecthood, that within this relationship between leaders and this so-called led, the led should not be treated as objects, as it. So overall, in this section then of part that I've just read, the main question is again a praxis based in communication, in equality, and in cooperation. A praxis that is dialogical, in which parties who are dialoguing are equal. So what he is constantly instructing us then, in opposition to conquest, which is an anti-dialogical mode, and where one dominant group conquers the minds and bodies of another, cooperation is where everyone within the revolutionary movement and praxis, they may have different roles, leaders and workers, but no one is thought of as less than the other. And two, leaders never take it upon themselves to assume that they know the way and people do not, and so people must follow. The dialogical method or praxis presupposes that people have come to a point where they, and that reference to looking at their own reality, right? Analyzing it. Remember, we had discussed it in chapter 3, how to create a curriculum. And part of that was to see which thematic universe is in which people exist, and then develop a curriculum with the help of the people where they get to see their reality objectively as it exists and analyze it. There's also a reference in this section to removing the veil. right? Now, that is a Marxian reference. Of course, in Marx, ideology is this veil that makes the people see the world from the point of view of their oppressors, because the oppressors are lodged inside them, right? And the idea of a revolutionary praxis of cooperation is to remove that so that people can see the true reality from their own subjecthood perspective. And that can only be done through critical pedagogy. It can't be just turned on like that. Now, do keep in mind that anytime there is a reference to a Marxian idea of ideology, it relies heavily on Marx's Hegelian humanistic imagination of the human subject. Because deep down, what it presupposes is that in ourselves there is a human subject capable of everything, centered, right? And all we need to do is enable, help, educate this person to see their true potential in the world, right? And maybe when you read Althusser and others, that will be slightly complicated. But the idea in this section that I've read, what's coming across is that the leader-led relationship need to be equal. It has to be a cooperation based in equality in which the leaders never assume that people must simply follow and they have all the answers, and people must be prepared, right? The Che Guevara quote that he cites in the next part of this section talks about it, why to be skeptical of the peasants, not because they don't trust the peasants, but because the conditions have not been altered for revolutionary praxis. And practically too, if everything has not been developed so far from conquest to cooperation, any revolutionary movement will become revanchist. It will become a sham revolution, and it will get appropriated by those who speak in the name of the people. So there is a caution against populism, against sloganeering, and focus on a more deeper transformation of ourselves, and hence the transformation of the world. To transform the world, we must first dislodge the oppressive self that resides in us, and then understand the world objectively by studying it. And then cooperatively, we must develop a praxis to transform it. So these are my thoughts on this part of chapter 4. I'll come back and finish my conversation on cooperation. Please keep in mind these are the last few videos in this quite an ambitious series that I think I had started about 3 years ago. It's not perfect, and I don't think so I have shared a total understanding of it, or even that my understanding is all that good. But when we're done with this series, my hope is that this will be one of the most comprehensive video resource for pedagogy of the oppressed. So thank you so much for your patience and for staying with me and for always sending me your best wishes. If you're new to the channel, the Paulo Freire playlist will come up. Please check it out and let me know what you think. Please stay safe, take care, and as always, from me to you, peace and love.